I enjoyed singing that last song of worship, just that part of "Then sings my soul." Oh, 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 oh. I really enjoy that song. It just took me back years ago, being on a plane flying out of Bellingham, flying back to Portland. It was just at sunset, and that song came on with my AirPods, and it was all I could do to not burst out in song on that plane. I know when I looked at myself, I was starting to move around. I think I actually was starting to whistle it. I do that. If you're by me, I was working so hard today. I whistle the worship songs a lot of times. So that was actually effort for me not to be whistling. It was everything I could do to contain myself because I just wanted to worship the Lord. And I hope that's how it is for you a lot of times. At our church, we say that our passion is just to know God more. We just want to know Him more. And we want to make Him known to more people. And I get the privilege and the challenge of taking a passage today and communicating it in a way that helps us to know God more, and a way that maybe will inspire us to make Him known to more people. And I'm just going to be straight up front with you. As we look at Genesis 29, starting at verse 31, this is a Jerry Springer episode, okay? When I worked construction in Bend, I worked at Cascade Heating and Cooling for a while, and I worked in the shop, and there was a buddy of mine. Every lunchtime, he would go and he'd watch half of a Jerry Springer show. And oh, I know. I could get it. I had to hear about it for the rest of the afternoon. And he would tell me about whatever crazy story was on there. And really what we're going to read today would be something straight out of there. And it's going to be interesting to really take this and see, how does this make us want to know God more? But that's the challenge today. As we come to this, just a little bit of background before we get into the text. We're at a time in Genesis where we're reading about the third patriarch. The patriarchs in the Old Testament and for the Jewish people are who? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. All right? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we're reading about Jacob's story now. And as we read it, we're at a time where Jacob has swindled the blessing and the birthright away from his older brother Esau. And I say older, it's by minutes because they're twins. But Esau has said, I am going to kill my brother. As soon as my father is dead, I'm going to kill him. So Jacob's parents send him away on a journey. And the journey is to go find a bride in the land where they came from their distant relatives. And when you look at this, you have a story of a man who thought he was getting everything. He was looking for the birthright. He was looking for his father's blessing. He got those, the things that he really wanted in life, and yet when he gained them, it all fell short for him because he ends up on the run with nothing all by himself. He's like a vagrant. Right? The guy's a hobo. And you look at it, and everything is going wrong. But what Jacob does have is he is told to go to this land, and that there he will find a bride. The Lord does speak to him in a dream and reassures Jacob that he will be with him and that he's going to find success there. So what we read last week is Jacob got to this place, and right away, while he is there, he sees her. Her. And some of you guys know exactly what I'm saying when I say that. He sees her. And he's just like, the world just got better. I was down and out, and obviously this is God blessing me. If I just have her, everything's going to go right. And it's like we read last week, this messed up story about how Jacob worked for 7 years for Laban in order to be able to marry Rachel. Absolutely incredible. He is so in love with her that it just seems, the 7 years, like a twinkle in his eye, right? Just out of curiosity, how many of you can't remember where you were 7 years ago? Yeah, I mean, 7 years is kind of a long time, right? That's incredible, and it's like a twinkle in his eye. But where he is just working so hard for this woman that he wants because she is beautiful in her face, and the scripture says she's just gorgeous even with her frame, he gets tricked into marrying the older sister Leah, the sister that nobody wanted. Nobody wanted, and he's tricked. So, because Jacob so badly has his heart set on Rachel, he ends up saying, I will work for you another 7 years in order to get her. And that's exactly what he did. So Jacob, at the beginning of this story, ends up with 2 wives. They are sisters, the older one named Leah, the younger one named Rachel. And this is where we pick up, Genesis 29, starting at verse 31. When the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. And Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben, for she said, because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, for now my husband will love me. She conceived again and bore a son, and said, because the Lord has heard that I am hated, he has given me this son also. And she called his name Simeon. Again she conceived and bore a son, and said, now this time my husband will be attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. And she conceived again. Oh, and therefore his name is Levi. And she conceived again and bore a son, and said, this time I will praise the Lord. And therefore she called his name Judah. Then she ceased bearing. Now, there's more to the story that we're going to keep reading, but just to look at this is one of those passages that's just gut-wrenching. You look at Leah, and she is the woman that nobody wanted. She ends up getting married because her father Laban tricked a man into marrying her. But with the whole drama, it's the night after the wedding, and instantly her new husband's like, what'd you do? I don't want her. I want her sister. I want her sister. And Jacob fulfills the wedding week, but as soon as the wedding week is over, suddenly he's going after the woman he really wants. And the way the story starts out is awful. The Lord sees what is going on. And remember, as I've told you over and over again as we go through Genesis, that's one of the main themes through Genesis. El Shaddai means the God who sees. Jehovah Jireh means Yahweh sees to it. You see over and over again throughout Genesis that the Lord is looking and seeing exactly what is happening, not only on the face of the earth as a whole, but in individual people's lives. He sees. And what does he see in Leah's case? She's hated. She's hated. So what does he do? He opens her womb. He gives her children. And that's one of those things you hear me say over and over again, children are a blessing. Children are a blessing. There might be times where you want to kill the little rugrats, but they're a blessing, right? And it's this thing where God's like, you know what? Your husband hates you, but I will give you children, and I will bless you in this way, Leah, in the midst of your circumstances. So it starts out with this beautiful thing, and the way she is naming these sons. At the end of this chapter, she has 4 sons. And if you notice, 3 of the 4 sons, their names actually have to do with the Lord. God's name is put into their names. That's incredible. Like, you look at it, my name. What's my name? Tim, right? Tim. Who said Timmy? Was that someone on staff? All right, we're calling HR tomorrow. No. Yeah, you look at it, and it's Tim. It's Timothy. Timothy. When I call in orders at places, I have to say the order is for Timothy. For some reason, if I say Tim, they always write Ken, right? And then they never find my order. But I say Timothy. What does Timothy mean? It's Greek, Timotheos. Tama, to honor, theos, God. One of my grandsons, his name is Theo. It's not Theodore, it's Theophilus, which means lover of God. You have a name like Elijah or Elisha. The L on the beginning is the name God. And you look at it, how incredible that as Leah is in this situation, God is blessing her. And at the beginning, there's this beautiful thing that's happening with her, that God is giving her these children, and she is recognizing that this is the Lord. And notice it's not El, the generic name for God. She is using Yahweh, Jehovah. It's Lord. She's recognizing who exactly this is that is working in her life. He sees her situation. He is giving her blessings. And at the beginning of this, 3 out of the 4 times, the names she gives her boys are a direct recognition of what God is doing in her life. And that 4th one, Judah, now I will praise the Lord. Isn't that awesome? The Lord sees her situation and is acting in justice and mercy in her life. Chapter 30, verse 1, it goes on and we read this. When Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she envied her sister. She said to Jacob, "Give me children, or I shall die." And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel. And he said, "Am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb?" Then she said, "Here is my servant, Bilhah. Go into her so that she may give birth on my behalf, that even I may have children through her." So she gave him her servant Bilhah as a wife, and Jacob went into her. And Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, "God has judged me, and has also heard my voice and given me a son." Therefore she called his name Dan. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. And then Rachel said, "With mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister and have prevailed." And so she called his name Naphtali. This story is just getting bad. It's getting bad. Rachel now is so envious of her older sister that her older sister has born 4 sons, and God's not blessing her, that she gets angry at her husband. In turn, her husband gets angry at her, and in this emotional fit, she says, "Fine, here's my servant girl. Take her, sleep with her, and when she has a baby, that'll be my baby. I'll just adopt that. And that's how I will be blessed." Yeah, that's messed up. That's messed up. When you look at this, in verse 8, Rachel says, "With mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister and have prevailed." In the Hebrew, that mighty wrestlings can be translated, "With mighty wrestlings with God I have wrestled with my sister and have prevailed." It's an interesting statement. It doesn't make that much sense the way it's put into English, so they subtract that little section. But the idea about this is that she is not only wrestling this direction horizontally with her sister, she's wrestling with her husband and angry at him, but deep down in the Hebrew, you get it, she's also wrestling with God in this vertical sense. Why haven't you given me this? Why are you blessing her and not me? And her anger is going this way towards God and this way towards her family. There's something she wants, and when she doesn't get it, the wrestling inside, internal, is bleeding out into the way she acts with other people, and now she's wrestling with all those around her. That idea of wrestling, it's going to be something we come up in another chapter or two with Jacob. But that wrestling, the intensity of it, that's one of those things for those of you that have never wrestled with someone, literally wrestled with someone, the amount of physical strength and stamina that sport takes is just immense. It's all over your body, every muscle, every joint, every tendon having to be tight and working, and you can gas out so quick if you don't have the stamina and the endurance for it. It is an incredibly difficult sport, and it's being used in this way to talk about that's how she is. She's just tense, she's tight, she's ready to go, and everything about her is on the attack. Verse 9, the story goes on. When Leah saw that she had ceased bearing children, she took her servant, Zilpah, and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Then Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son. And Leah said, "Good fortune has come." So she called his name Gad. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. And Leah said, "Happy am I, for women have called me happy." And so she called his name Asher. You notice in Leah's story, as we started out today, things were good, and she's praising God. She's just feeling blessed by what is happening, but now she is sunk to the same level as her sister. Fine, here's my servant girl, take her. And if you notice, all of the names she is now giving to her sons and to these other ones aren't directed towards God, but it's directed with the competition of what is going on the earthly level. Verse 14, in the days of wheat harvest, Reuben, that's Leah's oldest son, went out and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But she said to her, "Is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also?" And Rachel said, "They may lie with you tonight, or then he may lie with you tonight in exchange for your son's mandrakes." And when Jacob came from the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, "You must come in to me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes." So he lay with her that night. And God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. And Leah said, "God has given me my wages because I gave my servants to my husband." And so he called his name Issachar. And Leah conceived again, and she bore Jacob a sixth son. And then Leah said, "God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will honor me because I have borne him six sons." So she called his name Zebulun. Afterward, she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. Then God remembered Rachel. God listened to her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son and said, "God has taken away my reproach." And she called his name Joseph, saying, "May the Lord add to me another son." All God's people said, "Yeah. Wow. Now you get what I'm saying, Jerry Springer here? Studying this past week, it just It's so horrendous to see what is going on in this story. And I mean, you just want to look at this and say, welcome to the family. This is not the type of family I grew up watching on TV. I mean, I literally had to go back just to get out of this dysfunction a little bit. And the best I could do was go on YouTube, and I listened several times to the intro to the Brady Bunch. And how many of you don't know what the Brady Bunch is? I'm just curious. Yeah, okay. We'll talk. Yeah, Brady Bunch. You look at it, and at least in that story, you have this family that is coming together, and they're doing their best, right? But this is not that. This is like worse than The Simpsons. This is awful what is happening in this story. And what just happened? This is Abraham's grandson. We're reading through Genesis. We're reading about Abraham, the father of all faith. He is talked about all throughout the Bible, all throughout the Old Testament, throughout the New Testament. You go to Hebrews and you read about Abraham and just the incredible faith he had in God and how he was following God, how he trusted God, even when he loved his son so much that he loved God more and was willing to give up his son if that's what it took to have a right relationship with God. And this is Abraham's grandson who has made an absolute disaster of his life. Mistake after mistake after mistake after mistake. What is going on with this? Well, there's a lens that I think we need to look at this through. And it's a lens that in our current church setting that we don't often look at. I want to flip over to Romans, the first chapter with you. And maybe this passage can give us a little bit of an indicator of how we need to interpret this. I'm talking and I'm fiddling with my iPad. I keep pulling up the wrong verses. Fat fingers, it just happens. Here we are. Romans chapter 1, verse 21, the Apostle Paul says this. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. What is this passage about? As Paul starts out just his magnum opus, the book of Romans, and he's saying that the wrath of God, judgment, is coming to the earth because although mankind knows that there is God, we tend to exchange him for gods we create ourselves. And now you might look at that and say, I don't get what that has to do with what we just read in Genesis. Well, let me try to connect some dots. You see, we look at this and we think of idolatry as what I just read. People bowing down to images of man, birds, animals, and creeping things. There are parts of the world where you would go today where there are still shrines and statues that people will go to and pray to and sacrifice to these things, and they represent another being or another god. We even have them here. My favorite restaurant in town to go to. You might not realize this, but there's idols in my favorite restaurant. When you go in, and if you look, you can see literal idols with little sacrifices given to them. And, I remember years ago going to that restaurant and pointing them out to another pastor, and he was like, well, I have strong enough faith. I'm fine with meat sacrificed to idols. Are you okay with that? I'm like, yeah, I've read 1 Corinthians as well. And we're like, okay, well, let's eat, right? But there are literally people around us that still worship idols in that form. But as modern evangelical Christians, we tend to think that we are beyond that. That we don't worship idols because we don't bow down and pray to a statue that is in some shape. But you have to remember that those statues represent something. So in these days, as Paul was writing Romans, there might be a temple where people would bow down and worship a statue, and the statue represented Athena. But what did Athena represent? Beauty and sexuality. Beauty and sexuality. In our culture, we might not have a statue in a temple to Athena, but do people go to great lengths and sacrifice their time, their money, their bodies, and go to extreme states to look beautiful? Absolutely. And that is an idol. You might look at it, and in the Old Testament, I told you before how Moloch was the detestable god because they would sacrifice children to Moloch in order to find success. People wanted to have money, pleasure, to be successful, so they would sacrifice their children. And in doing so, they believed that Moloch would then bless them. And yet, how many people have destroyed their families? Not around for their families or their children in a more mild way. They have basically sacrificed their children on the idol of being successful in their business. There have been many theologians and philosophers that have basically said we as human beings are idol factories. There is always something that we worship, something that we think will give us life, that will bring joy to us, that will make us happy if we can just grab a hold of it. If we can just grab a hold of it. And yet the reality is they never fulfill that. So when you look at the story that we've been looking at today, you have a man, Jacob, that has destroyed his life. First, he destroyed it because he wasn't okay with being the second son. He wanted to be on top. He wanted to be the one that got everything. He wanted the double honor. He wanted the attention of his father, to the point where he lied and cheated his way to get that. He lied and cheated his way to get that. That's one of the ways you can tell if you have an idol in your life, is you're willing to get it at all costs. It doesn't matter what it takes. It doesn't matter if you break your own morals and principles that you've always stood by. You will break them because you want that. He ends up on the run. And what do we have in the next chapter of his life? Even though God says, I will be with you, I will bless you, I will do these things for you, Jacob's not operating in that way. Right off the bat, he sees her. He sees her. And he's literally a man who's saying, like, I want to have sex with her. I want her. It is total appetites, lusts. He is just driven by this. And he goes to great lengths to have it. Romance, sexuality. It's what he's going for. And you can tell how much he thinks that will bring him satisfaction, the fact that he works for 7 years. Nobody does that today. And it's true back then. Biblical scholars have looked at that and studied out different things. Nobody paid that kind of price for a bride back then. Absolutely nobody. He wants her. He has to have her. And when he gets her, is it enough? No. He's tricked into having 2 wives. But he ends up with 4. He could have said no. He could have stopped it. He could have done anything. But he has to have this. And it's like an addiction that just goes from one woman to another woman to another woman. Until what you realize in the story is his wives are prostituting him. You look at Leah, and it starts out with her where God is giving her children and blessing her in that way. But then these 2 sisters, they get to the point where they're looking at it through a cultural lens and through a maternal lens and saying the thing that is going to bring me happiness is if I have the family that I can give to my husband. Give me children. If I have children, my husband will love me. If I have children, I'm going to be fulfilled. If I have children, the women around me will say she's blessed, will say she's happy. And so they go after this idea of having an ideal family, and they're trying to do it in ways that they're criminal. They're awful. They're horrible. And the anger and the emotion starts bubbling out so that they're wrestling with God and they're wrestling with each other. They are going after idols. They're going after idols. And they're the same type of idols that we see in our culture today and within the church. Within the church. Here's the thing that's hard to understand about idols. We think of idols, as Christians, we think of them in terms as being really bad things, right? But anything can be an idol. And typically they're good things, as Tim Keller says, that become ultimate things. Good things that become ultimate things. I have to have that. I have to have it. Have you ever looked at somebody that seems joyful, happy, like everything is going right for them? And then something is taken away from them and they become a totally different person. It might be somebody who seems happy and joyful, and suddenly they lose a job or their business goes under, and everything in their life collapses. If you lose a job or your business goes under, is that the end of it? No. But for some people it is. And if that's the case, probably success is their idol. Have you ever looked at somebody where it seems like everything is going right in their life and they have a family that's going well and a marriage, and yet they blow it up by having affairs and affairs and affairs? I mean, you look at this story and it's like, wow, this is not the type of marriage that God wanted for us, and this is just going haywire. And you see that today. Family. It can be moms or dads, but especially to moms. It is entirely possible for you to make your family and your children idols, where you find your meaning and purpose in life by living vicariously through them, so that you put pressure on them to always do the best. You put pressure on them to be in this sport, in that club, in the other club. Pressure on them to get certain degrees and to have a certain type of career, even though they might not be built for that. They might not be built for it, but it's what you want and what makes you look successful as a parent. We create idols in our lives. And I look at this, and it's scary to me. This concept of understanding that we commit adultery in our own lives is something that hit me so hard a few years ago. I was listening to one of the best sermons I've ever heard. It was by a pastor who passed away just recently named Tim Keller. And his sermon was called The Great Demythologizer. The Great Demythologizer. And he showed how Paul in Acts goes to city after city after city, and the way he does evangelism, starts churches, and brings people to Christ is by pointing out the idols in the culture. It's not enough just to tell people you're a sinner, but he actually showed them how they were worshiping something that wouldn't fulfill their life. It's interesting because Tim Keller started his church in Manhattan in, I think it was 1992. Incredibly secular city. Churches were dying in Manhattan. Everything was becoming incredibly liberal. You had the financial district where people were all about, money. You had the artist district where everybody was into like free love and sex and all these other things. And he came in, planted a church, and the things started growing and people started coming to Christ because he took Paul's pattern and started exposing the idols that were in people's lives. He wrote a book called Counterfeit Gods, and if you want a really hard read but powerful, I would encourage you to check out his book, Counterfeit Gods. But I'll never forget it when I was reading that book, and I was like, hey, this is going to be a great book to get illustrations so that I can, shoot them at you guys. And I'm reading this book, driving to a retreat, and I got to a chapter, and I just wanted to weep because I realized at the time I had an idol in my life. And it's something that still creeps its ugly head. I'm driven to success. I want to see things go well in my mind, have it match up with what my dreams are as a church, as a body. And we're even starting to see some of those things happen. But I constantly have to check myself and be like, Lord, it doesn't matter if we have a church that's growing. It doesn't matter if we build a beautiful building. If you're not there, who cares? Because he has to be first, and that's what it's all about. What is it in your life that you put over God? Is it your work? Is it your safety and security? That's what happened during COVID. For some of you, it should have been eye-opening because you operated completely in fear for your life. You didn't trust God with your life. You trusted science. What is it in your life that you are totally putting your hope in? Is it God or is it something else? The only way to find these things is to really seek the Lord and pray about it. It might be asking the people closest to you to say, is there something that I operate in? Do you see like an emotional struggle I have? Is there something in my life that when it doesn't go right, I act abnormally? And a lot of times the people closest to you can figure it out. I would love to talk about this more, but it's getting late. I'm getting hot. And I have Mike and Ike's right there, and they sound really good right now. I'm getting addicted to Mike and Ike's. But it's not like an idol in my life. I can go without them. I want to end with this quote, and it's one that it hits me so hard personally. This is from Keller's book, Counterfeit Gods. And he says this: when you discover gods in your life, things that you have put above the Lord, that the way forward out of despair is to discern the idols of our hearts and our culture. But that will not be enough. The only way to free ourselves from the destructive influence of counterfeit gods is to turn back to the one true God, the living God, who revealed himself both at Mount Sinai and on the cross. He is the only Lord who, if you find him, can truly fulfill you, and if you have failed him, who can truly forgive you.